we're still on the way to a soft landing, but the's a little bit of turbulence before we're hitting the tarmac. Is that what I'm hearing?
It's been characterized as a bumpy ride, but yeah, hopefully soft landing in sight.
That's Councilmember Dan Strauss and Jan Duras, the chief economist at Seattle's Department of Economic and Revenue Forecasts, talking about an unsettled financial future ahead for the city. How is that going to influence Seattle's ongoing budget deliberations? Plus, what has changed in the mayor's newest plan for growth in the city? And why are two local transit agencies, King County Metro and Sound Transit, in so much trouble? We're going to be discussing these topics and more on Seattle News, Views, and Brews this week, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are mine. My co-host David Croman is on leave, and I am so happy to have with me Ryan Packer from The Urbanist. And Ryan, I got to say, I saw on your social media that you are reporting from Portland this week. Are you actually working or just taking beautiful shots of the city skylines? I wanted to check in on that.
Doing a little bit of both this week. So
Good to see. Beautiful city. I'm glad you're down there, and I'm glad you're able to join me for this. Thank you very much for that, Ryan. Thanks also to City Grind Espresso. I wanted to point out that they are the background noise sponsor for the audio podcast. Love them on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks always to the show patrons out there. An update, we should hear next week about Councilmember Strauss's balancing package for the budget, and thus we should know more about my future with my job and many others for the Seattle channel. So thank you for your continued support there. If you're listening, you want to be a patron, make sure you do it. We answer patron questions on the show. You get a cool decal like this one here. You access patrons first content before anybody else. So please support the show at Patreon, Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Also, grateful for Converge Media. The video version of the podcast is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, we're going to get rolling with right here, right now. Okay, Ryan, I'm going to talk economic forecast for the city of Seattle with you. There was this budget committee meeting for the council this week. I heard some mixed messages here. So the payroll expense tax, otherwise known as Jumpstart, well, revenue from that source is trending up. Same goes for the short-term rental tax and the real estate excise tax. But much larger economic indicators like sales tax, business and occupation tax, utility taxes, those are trending lower. End result, the council decided on going with a baseline revenue forecast. So not projecting major growth, but also not adapting a pessimistic revenue forecast either. And Ryan, I have talked to so many people about the council's work on the budget over the last month. It seems with this baseline approach, they're trying to stay in this middle of the road spot, very much Dan Strauss's lane there. And I'm wondering if that concerns you, if that seems like the right call, or whatever you might be noticing with these budget proceedings, big picture here.
well, to me, it seems like they are kind of taking that middle of the road approach, like you mentioned, which is probably a good call, given all these different very volatile funding sources. I think we found out yesterday they have about 20 million more of a shortfall to fill, based on
In terms of the budget deficit. Yeah.
the deficit. Yeah, which isn't really very much when you consider the whole scope of the budget. There's more, kind of positive signs. You mentioned the real estate excise tax, which is a little bit of a kind of an indicator of kind of the broader economic activity in the city.
Mm-hmm.
Not just new projects, new buildings going up, but buildings being bought and sold. And so
Yeah.
that's a good indicator, I think, in terms of what we might be headed toward.
Yeah.
But I think the broader issue with the budget here is sort of the long-term way that we're going to be using the payroll expense tax, also the jumpstart, also known as the jumpstart tax.
Yeah, I wanted
And
to
kind of
talk about that because it's just, and if I can jump in here for a second, Ryan, it's this whole idea of, hey, we've got this budget gap. We're going to use this overage from the payroll expense tax to fill it up. It sounds great in the short term when the stock market is rocking and these high paid employees, which is what this tax is all about, they get their stock option compensation, et cetera. And that looks really great. But I've just heard it a few times during the budget proceedings, and you've said it as well. This can be a volatile fund too when the market is not doing so well. So yeah, let's talk about this, the payroll expense tax and your concerns going forward here.
Well, it is pretty volatile, as you mentioned. It's kind of a few companies really that are kind of paying the bulk of it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the original intent of the tax was to fund city priorities that are kind of long-term issues: climate change, housing, economic, stability. And so
Yeah.
we're kind of setting a precedent with this budget that as long as we kind of leave those funding sources, those original uses for the funding at their previous levels, random number that we kind of picked in 2020,
Hmm.
that it's okay to kind of not only fund backfill the general fund to preserve city services, which is what this budget does, and I think probably most Seattleites are appreciative of not having their library hours cut, but also funding new priorities like upgrades to Westlake Park and expanding the unified care team.
Yeah, that's the part that I think is difficult for me, and I thought it was really interesting too, Ryan, and it was almost a crossover to a lot of the work you do with transportation. I think it was important to point out that we haven't had, other than, let's say, Climate Pledge Arena a couple years ago, or the waterfront, which is kind of wrapped up here. Those are massive sources of sales tax, and when we don't have a larger public project going on within the city of Seattle, that has a big impact on sales taxes, and I think that can't be. I think that's a significant piece of this too. Maybe Dan Strauss, I know, was excited about it. Hey, when we finally get Sound Transit rolling within West Seattle or within Ballard here, we are going to see some more sales tax revenue come. But I think that's a piece of this too when it comes to sales tax, which is a big driver for our local economy.
Yeah, I actually heard that yesterday too from Dan Strauss. Actually looked it up in terms of how Sound Transit pays for sales tax, and it's actually most of that project's actually going to be exempt from city sales taxes. So
Huh. That's what I'm gonna have to say to that. Yeah, well, I know that, Dan Strauss was excited about it, but I appreciate you doing that research because I know that's gonna be a piece of this going forward. But I wanna look a little bit closer, if I could, Ryan, at some of the pieces you've been covering in the Urbanist when it comes to the budget. I thought it was really interesting. There's a cut in Mayor Harrell's budget proposal that hasn't generated as many headlines. It's this plan to cut 9 jobs from SDCI, the Seattle Department of Construction and Inspections, which enforces land use code and renter protections. Then you got another 20 jobs set to be cut in 2025. Well, those are going to be eliminated a year early here. So you wrote that these layoffs represent just 7% of the department, but this could be significant at a time when, clearly from the forecast, the city is trying to ramp up some kind of development activity. So if the council upholds these cuts, what impact do you think that's going to have, Ryan?
I think that's an open question right now. So apart from a lot of the other positions that are set to be cut elsewhere in the city in this budget, the SDCI cuts are kind of in their own category because they're largely funded by permit fees themselves. And so
Hmm.
the city's been on a kind of a downward trajectory in terms of building activity for a couple of years now. I think there's kind of a wide acknowledgement that we may have kind of hit the bottom. And so it's an interesting time to kind of cut those people because the city is doing a lot of things to kind of try and get uh, building activity back up. They just
Hmm.
exempted buildings downtown from design review. They just
Right.
are encouraging residential construction, residential conversion of commercial spaces. And then we have the growth plan coming on the heels, which is going
Hmm.
to open up other areas of the city where developers might want to enter the into the market. So the question is sort of what this long-term impacts are going to be on the department, whether we're kind of cutting some of the institutional knowledge that is
Mm.
in the department that we're going to need in the coming years, as we're definitely, and interest rates are heading back on the federal level, which is expected to kind of restart a lot of dormant projects.
Yes.
So and so the question is like, well, how, the department is saying we're well, if we have a upswing in permits, we can quickly rehire. That could
Yeah.
take 6 9 months, but some of those people are going to go to other cities.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the fine line here, and I thought that was a very interesting point as well. The mayor's the mayor's folks on this, I know, were pushing back on the council a little bit when it came to this, when there was some concern about cutting these different people. It looks like if indeed some activity picks up, SDCI can relatively quickly bring people in. But again, as you're saying, that can take a matter of months to get people on board and get them trained, et cetera. I guess that's a piece of the calculus here too.
Yeah, I think you know the- obviously we don't want to kind of shoot ourselves in the foot because we mentioned the real estate excise taxes. It's kind of um, having long permit times is one way to get people to go build in other cities.
Yeah, right. That is such a I know it's a fine line here, but SDCI is one of those agencies that maybe not as public facing as some of the others out there, but certainly one that does have an impact on what happens for growth in the city of Seattle. And I'm so happy we're talking about growth, because we're going to wade a little bit further into the weeds here, folks, when we talk about growth. The mayor's new growth plan for the city of Seattle, Ryan brought this up a minute ago. It is promoting more growth, but is it enough to meet what Seattle needs in the next 20 years, as is required by the comprehensive plan? Ryan has some insights to share with us. We're going to break it down coming up on Now Hear This. Well, Mayor Bruce Harrell came out with an updated growth plan at the end of last week, building on a growth plan released back in March that many critics, even some of Harrell's allies on the council, said did not go far enough. Now, the October version has more. 5 new clustered growth centers at existing commercial hubs, which are now called neighborhood centers. And also, there are some updated regulations intended to increase the amount of multiplexes in areas formerly known as single-family zones. As the mayor explained it on the Seattle channel back when the comprehensive plan process really swung into gear in 2022, he has his eye on the future.
Seattle is ready to update its comprehensive plan, which we're calling the One Seattle Plan. By listening to neighbors and preparing for the needs of tomorrow, we're charting a path forward, preparing for growth, taking on the housing and climate crises, establishing transportation options, and supporting equitable outcomes for all.
Ryan, I'll just begin broadly with you here. What's your take on what the mayor has presented in this new version of the growth plan?
It's definitely a step in the right direction. The biggest issue that kind of happened with the original plan in March, there's a new state law, HB 1110, that the city has to respond to. It requires the city to allow at least 4 units on every lot in the city, and six near transit. And
yeah, a lot of people call this the missing middle plan. Keep going.
And so the city actually released its initial set of regulations that were pretty constrictive. So constrictive that they actually raised the eyebrows of some state lawmakers who had passed HB 1110, saying maybe this is actually going too far. They basically said that, you can build 4 units, but they have to be the same amount of square footage as a regular house. And so it's like kind of not really creating that incentive to actually build those units. And so this updated, and it actually kind of exempted big swaths of the city and said, actually, we're only going to allow 3 units forever, which was, I think, also probably in contradiction with state law. So in October last week, they got rid of that, and they're actually going to allow the 4 plexes to be larger than a regular house.
And that's a big deal for these former single family neighborhoods, it sounds like.
Sure. Obviously, it's not going to be a transformative change everywhere. We have a lot of single family zones. It's going to be more of a gradual process, but at least we're not kind of constricting it in literally every place.
Can I jump in there, Ryan? Because I think I remember hearing from builders back in March about this, about making sure these kind of things pencil out, which is always a concern. Sure, you can put the regulations in place, but does it actually make sense for builders to build in this way? Did you get a sense about that? Because, like I say, you can pass the law, but still, people have to do the building for it to be achieved. What was your take on that?
Sure. Obviously, we're still kind of waiting for the takes in terms of the actual details, which is kind of where these plans live or die. But
Yeah.
obviously, the amount of flexibility that you give builders is kind of the way that these are made to pencil. And so, if you have restrictive setback requirements, you have these floor space requirements. It doesn't give people very much to work with, and so the more units you're able to build, or the more square footage you're able to have, you're able to kind of be more flexible in terms of, well, we're going to be able to sell this unit for this amount, and that will be able to make it pencil.
Right. Can you talk about where a lot of this growth is still concentrated, though? Because I thought you brought this up in your piece, and it was a very cogent point here. There's so much growth that is very much concentrated around commercial areas where we see a lot of density already. And I know you brought up a concern about this, because still this might not be a situation where it's enticing people to grow in these lower density areas. It just seems like there's a lot of focus on areas like, I'll bring up 35th Avenue Southwest in West Seattle because it's right by where I live. It's one of those situations like, okay, let's build a ton here. And wait a minute, what about some of the surrounding areas? Can't some of that growth trickle out there? Can you talk about that dynamic and that phenomenon? Because I think that's one part where some critics might push back on what the mayor's saying here and saying, wait, you're really concentrating this growth still in a lot of areas and not spreading it across the city as much as you could.
Yeah. So the missing middle stuff we just talked about with the fourplexes, the city's expecting the capacity for those changes to only be around less than 100,000 units out of a total of over 320,000 unit capacity. So the
Mm-hmm.
rest of that is going to be largely in neighborhoods that are already dense.
Yeah.
The urban centers, which we're looking at upzoning even further beyond that 320 in the next couple of years. But
Mm-hmm.
also these new kind of clusters of growth they're calling neighborhood centers that are already areas that are pretty dense and walkable, but don't really allow multifamily housing right now. Places like Mont Lake, Tangletown. Um, but then there's what you mentioned, which is sort of these transit corridors. 35th
Yeah.
Avenue Southwest is a frequent transit corridor, and so they're proposing to allow around 6-story buildings, but only directly along 35th as the example there, and not even a block off of 35th. And
Mm,
so even if you could walk to the transit stop from a nearby street, they're still not going to allow a larger building there, which is
I see.
kind of perpetuating the existing paradigm. The Seattle Planning Commission called this out over the summer when they were reviewing the draft plan, kind of noting
Yeah.
like this is concentrating the growth around noise, pollution, traffic violence.
Yeah, that's a challenge there, and it turns into a situation where I guess those challenges that we've had before uh, keep on going, and I know that the planning commission wanted to avoid that, and I guess I wanted to make one more point on this, Ryan, which you talked about this capacity for 320,000, which sounds great. I mean, I know that sounds like a big number out there, but in terms of what will actually be achieved, does it look like we would actually hit the 320,000? And I know that's almost an impossible question to answer, but what's your take on that in terms of how many units would actually come out of this? I'm hearing that 320,000, but are we going to hit that number? What do you think?
Nobody knows really. It's definitely not going to be anywhere near 320 for a long time.
Okay.
Presumably, we would have another upzone. You can look at you can actually drill down to the parcel level and kind of look at some of these properties that have a big capacity on paper, kind of big box stores along Aurora that don't look like they're going to be developed anytime soon.
Mm,
So it's not really clear. The whole the way that we kind of maximize that is just like you have to allow a lot of flexibility within a individual project. You kind of have to allow a lot of flexibility across the city.
yeah, that's the bottom line I'm hearing here too. But boy, I really appreciate your insight on that, Ryan, because I know this is a project that is continuing into the future. And maybe just a last touch on this when it comes to this growth plan as it relates to the comprehensive plan. I know that that comprehensive plan was supposed to be wrapped up at the end of this year, but in reality, I think this is going to take a little more time because I know they're having some town halls, et cetera, that are running through December 20th here. They want some more public input on this. Is it more likely to say we'll have this new comp plan in its final formation at the start of 2025? What's your thought on that?
It's looking like it's going to be even longer than that.
Mm,
But the city is noting that they've actually never hit the state's deadline for a comprehensive plan,
hmm.
and we kind of have a lot of pull in terms of being able to get an extension
Right.
as the state's the largest city. And so this is going to drag on to 2025. We're going to have a discussion around the missing middle first, I believe, in first or second quarter, um, to meet the compliance deadline for HB 1110, and then we're going to go into the kind of denser node discussion, which is going to be really interesting, kind
Yeah.
of especially tackling those two separately in terms of what this city council is going to do.
Yeah, boy, I appreciate your insight on that, Ryan. And I know this is a long slog ahead and relatively new council taking on some of these issues. So we'll see what they have in store on that one. I did want to switch gears with you and pick your brain on transportation, which you report on a lot for the Urbanist. Everybody, please read Ryan's stuff. It's great stuff in the Urbanist there. Specifically, you had a piece on Sound Transit's expansion of Link Light Rail into Ballard. Things seem a little bit stalled out there, and I guess it's me and my West Seattle neighbors that are at least partly to blame. So what's going on here?
Well, I wouldn't say West Seattle's to blame. I think it's kind of the way that these large transportation projects kind of have to happen.
Yeah, I
Um,
know West Seattle is costing a lot more, which is throwing things into a little bit of a problematic situation here.
Yeah, cost estimates are up across the board. We did just get one for West Seattle, which is moving forward a little bit quicker than a lot of these other projects. And so it's looking like that's going to be around 75% more than we had originally thought, which is
That's a
a big
lot. That's
jump.
billions we're talking about there. Yeah.
Mhm. And so, the piece I wrote was kind of looking at where Ballard is, which is kind of the most regionally important project for Sound Transit 3. It's going to build a new tunnel underneath downtown Seattle and kind of increase the capacity of the entire light rail system.
Hmm.
You know, West Seattle is a $4 billion project now, about 7.5. Um, but Ballard is an $11.2 billion project. So you can kind of see what happens when we end up having similar amounts of cost increases and what that's going to have to do to the whole system. I think a lot of people are kind of wondering, what's going to happen. And so, but Ballard is a little bit in limbo in terms of the environmental review. Kind of had to start over because the project was originally paired with West Seattle,
I was going to say
like
those
you
those were
mentioned.
linked together for a while there, right?
We were kind of doing them in tandem, but we kind of spent a little bit of time on some station locations around the International District. There's a proposal from Dow Constantine and Bruce Harrell to kind of look at having a station near the King County Civic Campus, and then another kind of in South CID to avoid kind of having to tear up the heart of the Chinatown district for
Hmm.
several years, while also taking advantage of the transit oriented development opportunity that comes from redeveloping that county campus. And
Hmm.
so that's going to basically, require additional review. And so that had to be spun off into its own project. Um,
Okay.
and so it's just finally getting its scoping going again, even though we did scoping for the original project several years ago. And so,
Hmm.
but ultimately, we're just kind of waiting to see kind of what's going to happen next year when we get a bigger, presumably somewhat of a bigger cost estimate. Hopefully, not too big.
Yeah, that is. I've been hearing about these larger costs, Ryan, and I'm always hesitant to ask this question, but I feel like I have to. How are those extra costs going to be borne? I mean, is it a situation where elected leaders are going to have to ask for some more dollars from taxpayers? And I know a lot of taxpayers, I think I read in your piece there that maybe two-thirds of them are like, we want to push ahead, even if it does cost more money. They want these options out there. But how does that work? Is it another tax measure that voters are going to have to face, or what do you foresee there in terms of trying to gain those extra dollars?
Well, apart from getting federal grants, and obviously, I'm sure that Sound Transit is waiting on tenterhooks for the result of the presidential election
Good point.
in November in terms of what the federal grant outlook is going to look like. Sound Transit doesn't have a whole lot of other revenue options. They're set by the state legislature, um, and so the only lever that they have is delay. They can
Mm.
change the scope of a project and make it less expensive by delivering less transit, or they can delay and have it come 2, 3, 4, 5 years later as they collect more revenue. And so I
Which
think
would
that's
be
what.
the case with Ballard potentially, I guess.
Sure, and that was originally supposed to be delivered in 2035. Now it's at 2039, and so and it even then they're kind of looking at the idea of it terminating in Smith Cove and not going all the way to Ballard. And so as an initial segment, and so I think everyone wants to avoid delay, but there's only so many things that they could do if they, unless the state legislature were to authorize an additional tax for Sound Transit, which I think would be very politically unpopular, especially considering the myriad other problems that the state has with its own transportation budget right now.
No doubt, no doubt. Wow, great pieces there, Ryan. I really appreciate that. Well, coming up, if you thought Sound Transit was the only transportation agency out there facing some major challenges, you're wrong, folks. Some sobering news for King County Metro coming up on Now Hear This. Ryan, I wanted to touch on a piece you wrote for The Urbanist recently about what's been called a fiscal cliff for King County Metro. I've talked about this on this podcast before, the challenges this agency has had with bus maintenance, even finding enough workers to do that job. Plus, hiring bus drivers has been problematic too. But you're talking about something a lot larger and systemic here. What's happening with King County Metro?
Yeah, so Metro has been doing pretty well in terms of its finances for the past couple of years, largely due to federal cash during the COVID era. And so, despite the fact that ridership has been down pretty significantly, and with that revenue, um, they've been able to kind of coast along. But they have some big headwinds coming their way. Um, as ridership continues to kind of lag the pre-pandemic levels. Um, Basically their policy choices that have been made for Metro in the past couple of years are all kind of converging. But the biggest one of those is the commitment to electrify the fleet
Mm-hmm.
by 2035. And so Metro is set to spend a lot of money to convert its bases to electric, to buy buses that are electric in terms of creating all this infrastructure that you need to run the state's largest transit agency
Mm-hmm.
as an all-electric agency. And so, according to the projections, if they move forward with all these expenditures while at the same time collecting less revenue, they're expected to have a $500 million shortfall in their reserves by 2028, 2029.
Wow, I remember just in your piece there, you're talking about electrifying the fleet. They want to do that. They want more service. They want to improve bus security. They want to improve facility cleanliness. And it's kind of something needs to give here. Is it a situation where is there an appetite to try to raise some more taxes for this, or where are you seeing this fall out? Because I know even the executive was saying, Dow Constantine was saying, if you want to have all these objectives out there, that's great, but it's not going to be attainable with the current financial picture the way it is now.
Yeah, so I think there has been a lot of talk about a countywide transit service ballot measure that would have provided additional service levels, kind of going
Hmm.
beyond trying to get more frequent service elsewhere in the county.
Is it kind of like
And
a
so,
transportation benefit district, which I know Seattle has? Would it be something similar to that?
correct. And so the timing is set to work out that it's possible that Seattle's could expire at the same time that a countywide measure takes effect. And so basically upgrading from a city only measure to a whole county measure.
Right, right.
Obviously,
Which almost happened during the pandemic. Or it was right before the pandemic. I think they were talking about that, right?
yep, early 2020 there were discussions and they kind of got put on ice because of all the realities. So
Yeah.
um, the now we're kind of looking at having that be a little bit of a stopgap, but I don't think it's going to be enough, especially since we do need to grow service to accommodate our climate goals on that end in terms of giving people different choices. And so you kind of have the climate goals around electrification actually directly coming to a head against those other priorities. And so I think they're going to have to take a hard look at that. And another element of this is, you know, the county's electrification goals are very ambitious. 2035 is their goal, but electric buses are really kind of not quite there. We see electric cars all over the place, but um, the electric buses, there's only a couple manufacturers in the country, um, and it takes more buses to maintain the same level of service as a regular diesel because they have to take so long to charge. And so
Mhm.
we're kind of pushing the envelope in terms of what our existing technology can do. There's other agencies, including in California, which has a very similar mandate around EVs that are actually kind of saying, hey, we can't actually do this right now. We need to
Oh,
provide
wow.
service.
That's so many different things to juggle there. Ryan, I appreciate your reporting on that because it just seems like it's not as simple as just trying to raise taxes, et cetera. There's also that piece of it of just not even having the infrastructure in place to try to build these different things. But shoot, Ryan, I hate to say it, we need to wrap up, and I did want to make sure I asked this last question because you have taken trains, buses, ridden your bike. I know even been in a car a few times in the Seattle area. Do you have a favorite mode of transportation? What do you got?
It's ultimately got to be walking. I just, at heart, I'm a pedestrian.
Yes, I love it. I love it. He's making it happen on 2 feet. That's Ryan Packer of The Urbanist. Ryan, thanks a lot for being on the show. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Well, thank you, Ryan. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Thanks again to the patrons who support the show. It means a lot to me, especially with what's happening at the Seattle channel right now. If you are not a patron, join us. Find this podcast on Patreon, Seattle News, Views, and Brews. You can hear us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you like to listen. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. We'll see you next time.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2020.